Welcome, everyone, to the PCI Practical Matters podcast, 10 Myths of Government Contracting, myth number 5. Our speaker today is still Tim Sullivan. Take it away, Tim.
Thank you, Fritz. So, myth number 5, sticking with the subcontracting world. The myth is, my prime contractor will tell me what clauses should be in our subcontract. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard this one, and anyone who believes it's true needs some immediate counseling. Why? Because this is a recipe for disaster. Let's start by stating the obvious. A prime contractor has its interests to protect, and a sub must protect its own interests. Sure, the interests of the two parties are going to overlap a great deal, but they are never going to be identical. As I mentioned in myth number 4, there are a lot of landmines in a government contract and any subcontract issued under it. A sub, therefore, has to take the time necessary to ensure that the agreement it signs does not pose any unacceptable risks. And you can't do this without reading and understanding the document before you sign it. Now, you'll rarely be able to eliminate all risks up front, but you can try to identify them and minimize them. I am not suggesting that prime contractors are dishonest. The fact is that many companies serve as primes on some contracts and subs on others, and they are well aware that the strategy will be affected by their role, that is, whether they're the prime or the sub. Large primes are famous, for example, for sending a set of terms and conditions to potential subs, with a note indicating that these are the prime's standard terms and conditions, and requesting the sub to sign and return the document immediately. Incredibly, many subs do just that because they are so desperate for the business. But the fact that this document might contain the prime's standard business terms does not mean that they're identical to the sub's standard terms, and a sub would be foolish to simply accept them. Instead, the sub needs to review them carefully to ensure that it can live with what the prime has proposed. For example, primes frequently use a pay when paid clause, which we talked about in myth number 4, meaning that the sub will not be paid by the prime until the prime has been paid by the government. So a sub has to figure out when exactly that payment date might be. In some cases, it could be as long as 90 days after actual work has been completed. Can you last that long? The real problem in such situations is that the party with superior bargaining power will prevail, and subs therefore need to understand how much risk and pain they can absorb. That's a business decision. Lawyers can sympathize, but lawyers cannot resolve this for the parties. The business people have to do that. In taking tough positions like this, primes are not acting unethically or immorally. They are simply capitalizing on their leverage and the sub's hunger to get the deal done. And history tells us that this strategy works. Now, you could react to this point by concluding that it really isn't worth it to challenge what the prime has handed down because it will be a losing effort. But that's not the case. While some of the provisions will certainly come down to economic leverage, others won't. For example, the termination for convenience clause is unique to government contracts and enjoys such an elevated status that courts have held that it will be read into a federal prime contract even if the government agency neglected to include it. Now, most primes will include the termination for convenience clause in all their subcontracts because they want an exit ramp if the government should decide to terminate their prime contract for convenience. And that's a wise strategy for the prime. In the commercial world, however, a convenience termination would be nothing more than a breach of contract. And since the agreement between a prime and a sub is a commercial transaction, the sub should insist that any termination for convenience clause be limited to those situations where the government has actually terminated the prime's contract for the convenience of the government. The clause should also state that in the case of a partial termination of the prime contract, the prime will only be able to terminate that portion of the subcontract affected by the termination. So you've put a fence around the prime's ability to terminate the subcontract for convenience. Without such protection, a sub could be terminated for convenience at any time for almost any reason, depriving the sub of what we call the certainty of contract that is the hallmark of contracts. President Ronald Reagan once said, "Trust, but verify." He also said, "Trust everyone, but cut the cards." President Reagan used those phrases in the context of explaining the rationale for the extensive verification procedures that were to be used in our government's dealings with the Soviet Union, a high-stakes process. While your subcontract negotiations with a larger prime might not be of the same importance as diplomatic negotiations, they are important to you and your company, and your failure to protect your interests could lead to some unwanted problems down the road. Experienced prime contractors will not be offended by your attempts to negotiate certain terms and conditions. In fact, they'll be surprised if you don't. They do it every day with their primes.